Thank you, Madam President. Confidence in our elections is vital to self-governance, and voting is a fundamental right. This is something that Democrats and Republicans can agree on. Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution states that, quote, times, places, and manners, unquote, of congressional elections, quote, shall be prescribed by the states. Over the last year, my Democratic colleagues have introduced and tried to pass several versions of what they call the voting rights legislation, the For the People Act and For the Freedom to Vote Act. But these wholesome titles seriously are misleading. The bills are partisan power grabs that will give the federal government unprecedented power over our elections and weaken the ability of state legislatures to administer their own election laws. Federalizing election procedure would export traditional state authority to the federal government and defer decisions on how citizens elect their congressional representatives to Congress. This is inherently less responsive and less accountable. This legislation would undermine state legislatures by sending taxpayer dollars to political candidates for the House of Representatives, weaken popular state voter ID laws, and make updating voter rolls to ensure accuracy more difficult. According to a Gallup poll, 80% of Americans support voter ID laws, yet under this legislation, states would be required to accept essentially any document that includes a person's name as a valid form of ID. If you want to dispel the notion that voter fraud occurs in our elections, this is not a good start. One-size-fits-all solutions, that approach that the Democrats are pushing, is completely unfit for Kansas and for the country. Perhaps even more alarming, and this is the point that I would make more, I hope, strongly than what I just said, more alarming than this federal election takeover is the Democrats' proposed means of passing it. President Biden and Majority Leader Schumer, realizing the limitations of their slimmest possible majority in the Senate, have advocated for weakening the legislative filibuster. The ability for the Senate to debate legislation until 60-vote threshold is met. Ironically, Democrats utilized the filibuster vote margin just last week to block sanctions on Russia's Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Making use of the same 60-vote threshold they are so determined to demonize. The filibuster protects the minority. It doesn't necessarily mean Republicans or Democrats. It may mean just somebody with an odd idea. It may mean rural, where I come from, or urban, where other members of the Senate come from. It may mean the ability for a member of the Senate to speak on behalf of his or her constituents and advocate for their views. It allows every senator to have the opportunity to garner more information, to seek out sponsors of a bill, to have conversations, and to pull people together before we decide on how to proceed on legislation. But the filibuster does more than that. It forces us. I'm sorry it's necessary to force us, but it forces us to work together. Freedoms and liberties are protected by process. In today's world, too many people want the outcome regardless of how the process works. That process is called the Constitution of the United States, and in our case, there's rules of the United States Senate that require a 60 vote for legislation to be considered and passed by the United States Senate. In the circumstances that those are eroded, those process issues, it really, let me highlight that again, it bothers me so much that in so many circumstances, we set aside process because we want an end result. But in doing so, we erode the personal freedoms of Kansans and all Americans, and those freedoms and liberties are diminished as a result. I would tell it's unusual for me to have as many of my colleagues on the floor as there are today while I speak, and in this case, most are Democrats. I would say that if we want to change the United States Senate, and I'm a critic of the way that we do business here, I've never enjoyed serving in the United States Senate in which it worked well. If we wanted to do something that would actually make a difference as compared to change the process by which we consider legislation, how about having committees that actually do their work? How about having hearings and markups and debate? Give me the chance, give all of my colleagues the chance to participate in this democracy of developing legislation. But how many times have I voted on things that are garnered, put together, patchwork together, created by the leadership of the Senate or the leadership of the House, or working together a bill that is proposed by the White House? I want to have ownership, and even if I don't get my way, at least I had the opportunity, and it is the committee process that allows us to do that. And instead of fixing something fundamental as the Congress of the United States and having committees that work, we're going to change the process by which we can get to a bill or pass a bill and reduce the role that people who have different ideas play in that outcome. Give me ownership of legislation through a committee process. Don't take away my ability to better represent Kansans and Americans and people in the minority by changing the 60-vote rule. Americans voted for a Congress that is nearly a 50-50 split between the parties in the House and a precisely 50-50 split in the Senate. I don't think Americans voted to give one party free rein to implement an unprecedented power grab to nationalize elections and fundamentally reshape the way the Senate passes legislation. Thankfully, there's a bipartisan opposition to weakening the filibuster. A majority of senators agree it would bring about massive uncertainty for Americans who don't want to be subjected to the dramatic political swings when one election occurs and one party's in power and then the next party's in power. There's so much uncertainty in this world because there was never the consensus to build a 60-vote margin for a piece of legislation. We must have confidence in our elections. It matters. I want everyone who is legally entitled to vote to be able to vote. And I understand that voting is a fundamental right. But Kansans know best what's for Kansans, and congressional Democrats would be wise not to underestimate our resolve in making our own determinations. Madam President, I yield the floor.